Today, Donald Trump says, I'm winning a war by a lot. His FBI director says, I don't have a drinking problem. And another Trump cabinet secretary who denies having a drinking problem on the job was fired today or quit. What's the difference? Donald Trump's guiding principle in assembling his cabinet and staffing the government was loyalty to Donald Trump, followed by maximum outrage. Donald Trump obviously set out to pick people who had no significant professional standing in their fields or weren't even in the fields that they would be given jurisdiction over in the federal government. And the more the choice of those people could infuriate Democrats, the better. That's what got us Kashyap Pramod Patel as the most unqualified, indeed, the only truly unqualified FBI director in history. It was only in Kashyap P. Patel's lawsuit filed today against The Atlantic and reporter Sarah Fitzpatrick that I, for one, learned, quote, plaintiff Kashyap P. Patel is an individual who is a resident and citizen of Nevada. He's the first FBI director in history who lives in Nevada, in Las Vegas. He's also the first FBI director in history that we know of to have a girlfriend. And it isn't that we know of, okay, because all the rest of them were married. He's the only FBI director in history to have a girlfriend, and the girlfriend doesn't live in Washington, D.C. or Las Vegas, which means that Kashyap Patel uses an awful lot of federal government jet fuel on his government-funded plane for rendezvous with his girlfriend. Kashyap Patel filed a frivolous lawsuit today against The Atlantic, which he will surely drop as soon as he has to respond to real discovery subpoenas that The Atlantic is now legally empowered to bury him in, demanding via subpoena power internal FBI communications, including emails and text messages, to prove what The Atlantic reported under the headline, "The FBI Director is MIA." Kashyap Patel's lawsuit now opens him to discovery subpoenas from The Atlantic to prove everything that Kashyap Patel now insists is false and defamatory. Now, I'm about to read to you directly from Kashyap Patel's lawsuit a list of items from the Atlantic article that Kashyap Patel insists are not true. And remember, as I read this list, Kashyap Patel did not promise anyone that he would stop drinking in order to be confirmed by the Senate. That was Pete Hegseth, who had to publicly promise to stop drinking in order to be confirmed by the Republican Senate to become the Secretary of Defense for what was then a peacetime military. Kashyap Patel's lawsuit insists that all of the following items are not true. A, that Director Patel is known to drink to the point of obvious intoxication in many cases at the private club Ned's in Washington, D.C., while in the presence of White House and other administration staff. B, that Director Patel is also known to drink to excess at the Poodle Room in Las Vegas, where he frequently spends parts of his weekends. C, that early in his tenure, meetings and briefings had to be rescheduled for later in the day as a result of his alcohol-fueled nights. D, that on multiple occasions in the past year, members of his security detail had difficulty waking Patel because he was seemingly intoxicated, according to information supplied to Justice Department and White House officials. E, that a request for breaching equipment normally used by SWAT and hostage rescue teams to quickly gain entry into buildings was made last year because Patel had been unreachable behind locked doors. H, that on April 10th, 2026, Director Patel panicked, frantically calling aides and allies to announce that he had been fired by the White House and that his behavior was a freakout. J, that Director Patel's drinking has been a recurring source of concern across the government. On page 4 of Kashyap Patel's lawsuit, in one line, he completely undermines his own case, saying, numerous Atlantic pieces over the past 2 years have characterized Director Patel as unqualified, dangerous, corrupt, or mentally unstable. That means that The Atlantic did not hurt Kashyap Patel's reputation with its latest reporting, if for 2 full years The Atlantic has been reporting Director Patel as unqualified, dangerous, corrupt, or mentally unstable. And oh, by the way, why didn't you sue them for calling you mentally unstable? That actually sounds worse than being drunk in Vegas every weekend. As soon as discovery gets underway in this lawsuit, if a judge allows this case to actually get that far, Kashyap Patel will very quickly drop that case.
I know the best people. I know the best managers. I know the best deal makers. I know people that will make us so strong. I know guys that are so good.
The longest-running cabinet secretary in history was the first woman member of the cabinet, Frances Perkins, the pioneering social worker in New York who served in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration when he was governor of New York and then became his Secretary of Labor for every day of his presidency, which ended in his death in the 13th year of his presidency after winning re-election to a 4th term. Donald Trump's Labor Secretary had a remarkably long run for someone who appears to be completely out of control on the job while inviting relatives into the workplace. Former Republican Congresswoman Lori Chavez DeRemer was scheduled to be interviewed by the Labor Department's Inspector General in an investigation of possible serious misconduct in her role as Secretary of Labor. The White House announced that she resigned today, which just might be true because it will save her having to submit to an interview with the Inspector General. In a story titled "Labor Department Investigates Texts Among Secretary's Family and Staff," the New York Times reported Ms. Chavez DeRemer's husband exchanged text messages with young female staff members, as did her father. Some of the young women were instructed by Ms. Chavez DeRemer and the former deputy chief of staff to pay attention to the men. According to people familiar with the investigation, the text messages have been reviewed by the New York Times. The New York Times also reports that the secretary's husband, quote, was barred from the department headquarters this year after several women told the Inspector General's investigators that he was making unwanted advances at them. One of the women filed a report with Washington's Metropolitan Police Department, which opened a sexual assault investigation. The department and federal prosecutor's office later said they would not bring charges in the matter. The original complaint to the Inspector General accused Ms. Chavez DeRemer and her aides of drinking on the job and keeping a stash of liquor at the office, according to the New York Post, which first reported the complaint in January. The New York Times also, quote, Mr. Chavez has not been accused of wrongdoing, and a lawyer for the secretary's husband has denied the allegations against him. And so, 3 of Donald Trump's best people, 3 of Donald Trump's cabinet members, who all happen to be women, are gone. His Secretary of Homeland Security, his Attorney General, and now his Secretary of Labor. But Robert Kennedy Jr. is still there. And no one in the Trump cabinet or anywhere in the Trump government in their drunkest moment has ever said anything as vicious, as racist, and as purely evil as what Robert Kennedy Jr. was exposed, having said last week in a House Ways and Means Committee hearing. It is the single most racist thing spoken during our lifetimes by anyone in this country. Congresswoman Terry Sewell found a statement that Robert Kennedy Jr. made 2 years ago when he was a presidential candidate that most of us had no idea he'd ever said, and that, of course, he immediately lied about and denied that he ever said that. The statement proves that Robert Kennedy Jr. is obviously a deep and reflexive and casual racist. And so it might have seemed especially effortless for him to call a black woman a liar during his testimony, because that's in effect what he did. Congresswoman Sewell read Robert Kennedy Jr.'s words to him from a podcast that was released on June 30th, 2024, and Robert Kennedy Jr. simply denied saying those words. We then obtained the tape of what Robert Kennedy Jr. said, and we proved last week that he was lying to Congress when he accused Congresswoman Sewell of lying. What Congresswoman Sewell accurately quoted Robert Kennedy Jr. as saying was that every black kid, that was his phrase, every black kid needs to be reparented. That Nazi-sounding word, reparented, meant that Robert Kennedy Jr. was promising that if elected president, he would remove every black kid from their homes, rip every black kid from the arms of that kid's mother or father, and bring them to some kind of federal institution that he would create so that those black kids could be reparented. That was his word. And so there you have the ravings of a racist madman, a racist, Nazi-minded madman, falling on the deaf ears of the Washington press corps because the madness of Donald Trump and the madness of Donald Trump's war and the madness of Donald Trump's best people working for him, including an FBI director accused of drinking too much and a cabinet secretary being fired or quit so she can avoid an investigation of her conduct. But I have a bit more to say about the virulent racism of Robert Kennedy Jr. tonight, and you'll hear what his cousin, the daughter of President Kennedy, Caroline Kennedy, had to say about Robert Kennedy Jr. when she publicly begged Republicans in the United States Senate not to confirm her cousin and unleash him on the children of America as the single most destructive human force ever deliberately aimed at the public health of children in America who were saved during Robert Kennedy Jr.'s childhood from the scourge of polio by the stunning success of the polio vaccine, a success that Robert Kennedy Jr. now lies about and denies. The cabinet secretary who did have to promise to stop drinking, to be confirmed by the Republican Senate, is the cabinet member who Donald Trump will probably be blaming the most at some point in the future for Donald Trump's war in Iran. Marco Rubio, James David Vance, and others will spend the rest of their lives insisting that they privately advised Donald Trump not to launch a war with Iran. But Pete Hegseth will have a more difficult time with history for a couple of reasons. The first being that when you illegally try to rename the Department of Defense the Department of War and then illegally call yourself the Secretary of War, you are by definition a warmonger. The other problem for Pete Hegseth is, of course, that there's no evidence Donald Trump would, under any circumstances, ever solicit or listen to a word of advice from him about anything. And it also seems apparent that Donald Trump is running this war himself, mostly by tweet. At 2:11 p.m. today, Donald Trump announced, "I'm winning a war by a lot. Things are going very well." That is Donald Trump's latest assessment of his war. I'm winning a war. But as we know, that assessment is subject to change at any moment and is always false. It was only yesterday that Donald Trump once again publicly threatened to commit war crimes in Iran, which is in and of itself a war crime, the public threatening of war crimes. Donald Trump said, "We're offering a very fair and responsible deal, and I hope they take it, because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy, exclamation point. It will be my honor to do what has to be done." Couple things. It will be my honor to commit war crimes is something that the worst American war criminals never said. Lieutenant William J. Calley, who murdered more than 340 Vietnamese villagers at close range, gunpoint execution style, men, women, children, babies, grandparents, never said, "It will be my honor to murder Vietnamese babies." It's only Donald Trump who thinks threatening war crimes and committing war crimes will be my honor. And Donald Trump threatening "no more Mr. Nice Guy" in capital letters with an exclamation point really has no meaning for a person who has not spent one day of his life as a nice guy. Donald Trump has gone from saying 2 weeks ago there was no need to negotiate anything with Iran because he had already won his war, to now publicly and repeatedly sending his completely inexperienced negotiators who have never negotiated with Iran to come up with a peace deal. And today, at 1:35 p.m., Donald Trump made a simple promise about that deal. The deal that we are making with Iran will be far better than the JCPOA, commonly referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal was negotiated by President Barack Obama through his State Department, beginning with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and concluded successfully by Secretary of State John Kerry. Donald Trump has never said one true thing about that deal, which was the single most important diplomatic achievement of our lifetimes, and there isn't a close second. The United States negotiating partners in the deal were China, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany, an unprecedented alliance brought together by President Obama. Donald Trump has no negotiating partners with Iran, not one. And Donald Trump told this lie about the deal that John Kerry negotiated. It was a guaranteed road to a nuclear weapon, which will not and cannot happen with the deal we're working on. The deal that Donald Trump ripped up in the first year of his presidency, the deal John Kerry negotiated, the deal President Obama agreed to, the deal Iran agreed to, says on page 3, Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. Iran put that in writing and signed that 11 years ago. And one of the first things Donald Trump did as president was to rip that up. And now he is begging Iran to agree to exactly those words once again. Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. President Obama did not threaten to commit war crimes in Iran to achieve that agreement. President Obama sent the most experienced and expert negotiating team ever sent on a diplomatic mission for the United States of America. The negotiating team included Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, a nuclear physicist, and other nuclear experts. There is not a single nuclear expert in Donald Trump's negotiating team.
What we are witnessing is not just political drama, but a deeper pattern about power, loyalty, and the consequences of prioritizing spectacle over substance. The recurring theme in this narrative is not governance, it is performance. And like any performance built on exaggeration and denial, it eventually begins to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The idea of assembling a cabinet based primarily on loyalty rather than competence is not new in politics, but the scale and visibility of it here feels different. When expertise becomes secondary, the institutions themselves start to weaken. The problem is not simply that individuals may be unqualified, it is that the system begins to normalize that lack of qualification. Over time, this reshapes expectations. People stop asking whether someone is capable and instead ask whether they are loyal enough or controversial enough to fit the mold. This creates a feedback loop where outrage becomes a credential. The more a figure provokes critics, the more they are seen as effective within that system. But outrage is not governance. It does not solve problems, negotiate peace, or manage crises. It only sustains attention, and attention, while powerful, is not the same as leadership. The lawsuit mentioned in the script highlights another recurring pattern, the use of legal threats as a form of political messaging. Lawsuits in such contexts are often less about winning in court and more about shaping perception. They signal defiance, rally supporters, and attempt to discredit critics. But they also carry risk. Legal processes demand evidence, and once that process begins, narratives are no longer controlled by press statements or social media posts. They are tested, scrutinized, and documented. That is where performance meets reality. At the same time, the allegations of misconduct, whether proven or not, point to a broader issue of accountability. When those in power appear insulated from consequences, it sends a message that rules are flexible depending on who you are. This erodes trust. Not just in individuals, but in the institutions they represent. And once that trust is damaged, it is incredibly difficult to restore. The turnover within leadership positions further reinforces this instability. Frequent resignations or dismissals create an environment where continuity is lost. Policies shift, priorities change, and long-term planning becomes nearly impossible. It becomes less about building something sustainable and more about managing the chaos of constant change. Then there is the rhetoric, particularly around war and international relations. Statements that frame conflict in simplistic, almost triumphant terms may resonate with certain audiences, but they ignore the complexity and gravity of such situations. War is not a scoreboard. It is not something that can be won in a tweet or reduced to a single declaration of success. It involves human lives, geopolitical consequences, and long-term repercussions that extend far beyond any single administration. The casual discussion of extreme actions, especially those that could violate established norms or laws, is particularly concerning. Even if such statements are never acted upon, they shift the boundaries of what is considered acceptable discourse. Over time, this normalization can make previously unthinkable ideas seem plausible, even reasonable. That is how standards erode, not suddenly, but gradually. The comparison with past diplomatic efforts is also telling. Negotiation is slow, complex, and often frustrating. It requires patience, expertise, and a willingness to engage with opposing perspectives. When those efforts are dismissed or undone without a clear alternative, it creates a vacuum. And filling that vacuum is far more difficult than dismantling what existed before. What stands out most in all of this is the contrast between image and reality. On the surface, there is confidence, certainty, and boldness. But beneath that surface, there are contradictions, reversals, and inconsistencies. Claims change, positions shift, and narratives evolve depending on the moment. This creates a sense of unpredictability that can be both politically advantageous and deeply destabilizing. Ultimately, this is not just about any one Vyekti or administration, it is about the standards we expect from those in power. Do we value expertise, accountability, and consistency, or do we reward spectacle, loyalty, and provocation? The answer to that question shapes not only the present, but the future of governance itself. Because in the end, institutions are only as strong as the principles they uphold. And when those principles are repeatedly tested, ignored, or redefined, the consequences are not immediate, but they are inevitable.